I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And in this video, partly based upon requests and also based upon thoughts I've been having and ruminations on this topic within the internal space of my mind, I want to discuss in this video the emotional experiences of an INTP. In particular, the emotional experiences of this INTP, and I use that preface because I'm not saying that this is exactly the emotional structure and experience of every INTP, because human emotion to begin with is a very complicated matter insofar as what really creates our emotional frameworks is somewhat extant from our birth in the individual, but given our temperament, but then also what our environment does to us and how it shapes us over time, and sort of the societal structures. There's just so many things to come into play in the factor of someone's emotional makeup and the space of their emotional experience, but nonetheless, hopefully this can be as general and as, well, I don't think objective, but as general and as insightful as such an analysis of this variety can be, because I am now talking about something that is highly, highly subjective and qualitative. So, I suppose first I'll begin with saying that the stereotype that exists for so many people is that INTPs don't have emotions, and there have been several videos made on how this is not necessarily true, and I suppose the sort of collection of propositions I might like to add to this is that INTPs, we have the ability to be so one-sided in our emotional presentation, not really our internal emotional space, because that's not something that an INTP is willing to show to an individual, but just in terms of our emotional presentation, because we have dominant introverted thinking and we suppress extroverted feeling, and introverted feeling is the last function within the order of our shadow functions. We easily have the ability to be pedantic and rather emotionalist as individuals, or at least present and express ourselves in that manner. It's almost like a temptation and a call for us as INTPs to be so one-sided, because particularly our interests and the things that tend to catch our attention aren't things that are emotionally driven to begin with. Analysis is not a process at which emotions contribute any sort of safe and useful structure to. It can be so easily shown how emotions will bias one's perception of a given situation, object, or person. And an INTP, we can't be completely objective as people, but we are the type that strives to be as objective as possible given human limitation. And because of that, at least in our presentation, we do not, and even in our conscious volition, just what we cogitatively go over, we do not want emotions within that sphere, in that space. What can be rather difficult and troubling is just that I think, and it's merely a hypothesis or a conjecture, that for INTPs, our prefrontal cortex develops probably sooner than the rest of our brain, and it probably develops quicker than the other parts of our brain, or I would say begins to myelinate and turn on. Rather, it boots itself up, sort of like a computer, quicker than the other centers in our brain, in our mind do, and so it's easy for an INTP to become one-sided insofar as their just cognitive development. I remember specifically being in high school and probably having the emotional maturity of a 9-year-old, if I'm being honest. And so far as that, when I say emotional maturity, one thing about the internal emotional space for me as an individual is that I said it in previous videos that my internal space in general is one that's fairly intense, and it's not wrought with a lot of emotion, but it's fairly intense. And also, I'm extremely sensitive to external stimulus, sounds, noises, things in the environment. So that just seems to be the composition of what shapes my internal sort of subjective experience and emotions. Once they finally do enter the fray for a very long period, I suppose you can think of it analogous to a storm. For a very long period, my emotions, they're like faint echoes. For me to know that I'm experiencing them, I have to pay a tremendous amount of attention, and I don't really differentiate them in the real time of a situation. It's not until I have had the ability to step back from situations and be retrospective and introspective that I knew in that moment I felt any sort of way to begin with. And in that present moment, or even when I take and do that analyses, that just retrospective action, they're very faint. So faint and to saying that I would not be able to really determine what the impetus, what the root, what the cause for such emotion is, not in any sophisticated manner. This is when I typically go to my NF friends who are much more sophisticated at this type of thinking and analyses, if one wants to call it that, and get their input and their feedback, because they can pick up and differentiate emotions on a level, even my own personal ones, that I can't do necessarily. And they're faint. That's the best way I can say it. It's not that they're non-existent, it's just that they're faint, and they're specters, things that spontaneously emerge within my conscious mind, that whenever I'm going through a process such as thinking or being deliberative on something, introverted thinking shoots them down rather quickly. They rise up like little specters, and then they're shot down with such expediency and impersonal volition that they don't. Seldom times do they manifest, but that doesn't mean they go anywhere. And this is sort of the problem with an INTP, and with myself. I just noticed with me and handling my emotions. I experience emotions, but they're faint to begin with, and they start as small things. But then I'll go through this process of sort of expediting them off and silencing them and getting rid of them. At least I think I'm getting rid of them, but then it goes from a faint echo to a impartially differentiated thunderstorm. And I mean this, so I don't know if all INTPs experience this, but I notice I do experience this when my emotions finally strike me. They're like a wave, a very, very strong wave, or as if some sort of weather pattern or weather system has set itself over a landscape. It just it's just dark. It completely clouds the sky and is there, and it's as if going from sunny to hurricane rather quickly. And that's what it's like for my emotions to finally dawn on me, or just for them to finally present themselves in all their alienated majesty and in their anger and frustration with me, certainly. And when this happens, it's paralyzing. I mean, I'm completely inert in the face of them. I don't have. It's kind of sad. It's kind of sad and embarrassing for me to actually articulate that, particularly on the internet. But it's really sad because I don't have any means of dealing with them per se, in the way that people would think one should be able to deal with their emotions. I mean, okay, I don't know how to describe this particularly, but it's just I'm like a deer in a head. I'm a deer in the headlights, quite literally. Um, at least with the very complex and nuanced emotions that come with the human experience. I don't. So as I suppose I can regress and say as an INTP, I do experience certain types of emotion with quite a bit of regularity, and they're just a part of my internal space. Anxiety, low levels of anxiety would be one of them. I'm almost quite anxious about things, and then I don't know if it's neuroticism, quite honestly, but I know I'm hypercritical of my thoughts, of my actions, and just what I'm able to produce and manifest in my work. And so those things, the anxiety, people make me anxious. A lack of accomplishment at times can make me anxious, very, very, very anxious, and depending on how delayed any sort of accomplishment has come. I think that's also another thing that people don't realize about INTPs. We do care, even though we seem like we don't get much done. Really, we do care to some extent about what we actually do. When we finally do something, we care a tremendous amount about what we actually do. And those things strike up a lot of anxiety in me and can pull up a lot of negative emotion, particularly indignation and aggravation. But to say, so those are things that are just consistently humming and going on. It's just that extroverted feeling, sort of background noise that's kind of constantly playing in the underlying current of my brain, my motives, and my actions. But in terms of the actual, I suppose, emotions that people experience, as in sorrow and elation and terror and things of that nature, I don't really experience those until they're very real, punctuated, visceral sort of manifestations of those things, and they'll sort of echo and appear like will-o-wisp or just faint specters that if you try to grab at them, they dematerialize and disappear at the same time. They're sort of like, the sprites of mythology, but then suddenly, holy hell, they come back like a real dragon of some sort, and I'm just paralyzed in the face of them because it seems, one thing I notice about my emotions when they strike, they're not differentiated. So when I talk to an INFP friend, I notice how much introverted feeling, when it goes through emotions, it's like an aurora borealis, as in it's a spectrum. They feel everything at one time, yet the emotions are differentiated and completely differentiated and partially differentiated all at the same time. It's really weird. The best analogy I can say is the aurora borealis, because you see the distinct reds, you see the distinct yellows and purples and whatever have you on the spectrum, but then it's just sort of morphing and evolving from the one to the next, from one to the next, and then add on. But it seems that my emotion is not. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting. All the things are just thrown on it at one time, and there's some differentiation here and there, but it's so it's so dang poor that it's really hard for me to know what the heck I'm looking at a lot of times when I finally experience them. That's why when I get rather emotional, one, I tell people, you don't want to see me emotional. I swear I had a girlfriend that was like, you don't show any emotion, you don't show any emotion. And I finally tell her, you don't want to see me emotional, because if by the time I'm willing to express those sort of deep emotions that other people seem to express with such regularity, it's too late. Things are really bad at that point in time. It means I've given up sort of on logic and all these other things that I have to keep those things in check, and I'm at the mercy of them now, rather than actually being able to work with them or do anything constructive with them. They're just not. It's not fun to go through an emotional period, at least in that sense. So emotions I do experience and feel. I do feel sorrow at times, but I think here that I should talk about introverted thinking's the FETI axes, and why it may explain the sort of emotional landscape that an INTP consistently might, at least the structure it might take. And again, this is a hypothesis, because it's not as if I've sat with other INTPs. I only know 2 other INTPs out in the real world, and it's not as if I sat there and talked to them about their emotions, because we don't talk about things like that. But it's just, and so it's only my NF friends that can actually get it out of me. It's kind of freaks me out how they can disarm me in some respects and just get to what's inside of me. Man, for a long time I did not like hanging out with this one INFP friend, because they're just so dang, I don't know how they can do it. They're like, if you've seen How to Train a Dragon, the second one, and the main protagonist's mother, when she goes up to Toothless, his dragon, and sort of tickles him and gets him to release all of these aspects of himself that he didn't know he had. That's what it's like. That's what it's like with this INFP friend, and I didn't like that experience for a very long time. But I don't want to. Sorry, not to digress anymore. But it's to go here and say that. So primarily introverted. So a lot of times people talk about introverted thinking as if it's something that lives out on an island all on its own, and it's this independent, autonomous operator in the mind of the INTP, or just in the mind of any individual in general. And that's not true. Wherever you find TI, you're going to find extroverted feeling. And this is the sort of structure, I suppose, that all of the INTP's just emotional wherewithal is going to be made up. And I can distinctly remember being a child. Well, I won't say distinctly, because I don't trust human memory all that much, but I have these faint memories, and they seem distinct. But I'll say this, that I know as an INTP, my sort of emotional landscape is heavily determined by the community and people around me. And that may sound odd as me wanting to be the autonomous agent that I am, but people, since I've been young, have always had sort of the power to elicit responses out of me in the way that ideas and objects can't particularly do. And it's, I think, so I suppose why I'm mentioning that is just to say this, that all the emotions that I experience, they seem to have something to do with my relation to other people, and not really my relation to myself per se. It's even my relation to myself is oftentimes emotionally shaped or colored by the current interplay of at least what I consider the meaningful or the relevant people relation dynamics in my life at the time. And it's quite interesting when you read the biography of Albert Einstein, or watching the movie Imitation Game with Alan Turing. And Alan Turing was, I think, an uh, IS. I don't know what Alan Turing was, but certainly in that movie, what they portrayed him as wasn't quite accurate to what you find in his biography. But in that movie, Alan Turing looked, at least from my analysis, as an INTP. And what's so interesting is that for an INTP, we share this sort of with the INFP, and to whereas our emotional space, at least the negative aspects of it, are greatly determined by people and our disappointment with people. At least I think, at least I just noticed that in myself. I don't really know for other INTPs, but I know this, that when I found out that people just did not concern themselves with details nor accuracy, and were not really as intellectually as concerned as me, and I think I was about 5 years old when this dawned on me. I felt tremendously alone it was difficult, because I think when I don't know really how an INTP's mind develops, but I know when I was very young, I was concerned about truth and just inspecting reality around me, just what made sense. But I cared a lot about the community and the group of people that were around me. Not care in some, I was never caring so far as just what makes sense. I don't know any other way to say it. It's just you're kind of concerned and interested with people, and people are very interesting to this day to me as an INTP, and I can't help it. It's something that seems to be so just natural and innate, but it's just that interest can also be a very, very strong point of departure and disappointment for an INTP, because most people just don't get you. They don't understand you, and they don't really, and some people just, I don't know if INTPs really have the highest IQ out of all the types. People say that all the time. I don't think IQ and personality have as strong as a correlation as many others postulate, but if you're, I'm smart, and so when I found out most people weren't smart, that was just quite difficult for me. And so I think the emotional landscape for an INTP is quite honestly something that's going to deal with anxiety, particularly driven by people and their work, which I'll talk about soon, and just whatever they deem as important, or the community or the populace they deem as important. I think it's really something I'm realizing, and as I'm getting older, it's rather important for INTPs to have colleagues and to have a community in which they can interject their work, their thoughts, and their ideas for their own self-esteem and belief in their efficacy, because INTPs, we're wholly internalized individuals, but at the same time, it's the external world and our interplay with it that actually validates the internal frameworks that we have. It's quite peculiar and actually quite frustrating, because but anyways, it's just that self-esteem, it seems to derive from my intellectual efficacy, my self-efficacy, my own ingenuity. That's where it all emerges from. And in negative emotion, I don't particularly like it all that much, but it's something I do experience because I am an entity extant within the world, and I go through emotions, but they're not very well differentiated things. They're like one-eyed cyclops, or they're like four-headed monsters, really, rather than any singular majestic beast appearing to me at any one time. It's sort of like they're just not fun. They're really not. When I'm happy, it's like even that doesn't stay there, because as an INTP, I don't know if this is my personality I don't know if this is an INTP or just me per se, but I have to be careful about how much emotion I allow myself to have. And what I mean is this, that it's quite easy. I like to stay on the even keel, but it's quite easy for me to get too high on one spectrum or too low on another spectrum. I'm not implying that bipolar or manic or anything like that, but I'm saying that I think because of the relationship between dopamine and slackers, and just it seems like the dopaminergic system's high, it's just a high marker, or just a high contributor, or a very large it's a high marker, high contributor. I don't have any other way to say it. And extroverted intuition and just NP types in general, it seems that if I'm not careful, I can get so jovial and so elated on something that I think or I experience, to where it will stop being real at a certain point and become something rather dangerous for me. And I'll approach ideas of grandeur, not me of myself thinking, not me of thinking myself as grandiose, but definitely what's possible. And I'll step away from reality really quickly. And it's the same thing in the polar opposite direction with negative emotion. I shouldn't sort of indulge in those aspects of life. And one thing I've learned is just that you manage emotion in the little sprites and the little will-o-wisps that come here and there, and sort of not feel out, but get an NF, have them feel out, and then think to why it's actually occurring. It's really funny. They're like my witch doctors and soothsayers. I come to them like sort of Nicodemus in the night to Jesus, like, hey, I got this emotion. What do you think I should do about it? Like, because I don't really know. It's like I'm almost ashamed sometimes that I'm human, but that's really what happens. And they're like, oh, poor you. Come here, let me, like, oh, silly little INTP. let me set you straight here. And because and it seems time and time again that the things that sort of drive my emotions and cause me to feel things have to do with things about my own self-efficacy, my own intellectual efficacy, what I'm able to actually do and accomplish. That seems to weigh heavily on my emotional space, and I can't be particularly even jovial if I don't have goals and something I'm pursuing. It's it's often said about INTPs is that we're lazy, but it's just that most things aren't stimulating and engaging. It's I desperately look for problems in the world and things to stimulate my intellect and engage me in reality, because it seems to be that that's really the only thing that if I have it, I can stay on an even keel. With the sort of emotional makeup that I have, I don't think I have the luxury that so many other people have to just be awash in life and sort of drifting from thing to thing, because my emotions, they don't seem to just lend themselves to easy understanding nor communication, but they have a whole heck of a lot to say about where I go, and they're just not necessarily kind nor friendly to me, or just at least to my mental space. And they don't particularly lend themselves useful to the processes that my brain wants to sort of interject and embark me on. So it's this very frustrating complex of just things. Sorry, that's extroverted intuition coming out a bit there, but it's just to say this, that they're going to weigh in at some point, at least is what I've learned, And it seems that the things that they weigh in on have a lot to say about what I'm doing presently with myself rather than anything else. And how people are responding to what I'm doing rather than anything else. And honestly, addressing just this nexus point between what I'm trying to accomplish and what I'm trying to do, and what people do with it is something that helps me maintain my emotional equilibrium to the best way I can say it. I just know in myself that I can easily become nihilistic very quickly. And it's not that I care about what people think so much, it's just that I'm sort of irrationally driven to be an autonomous agent while at the same time being deeply concerned and having these very strong humanistic elements that underpin every damn thing that I do, and it's rather annoying, but it's the space in which I live in, and I address it as such. I'm going to check some notes really quick to make sure I cover everything I wanted to say, but okay, and so I will apologize for the length of this video because I don't know how to say anything about my emotions in any linked, succinct, and efficient fashion, because I really don't talk about this, and it's really hard for me to say this out loud while being recorded. But I think one last thing I'd like to say, at least on my emotions. So there's this interesting relationship between TI and FE, and I think it just arises from here because I got no other explanation for why I actually feel this way sometimes. So there's a lot of problems in the world. I'll just say it like that. And what can really bother me is when the problems in the world are a result of just stupid thinking. It's just when somebody does something stupid and it hurts a lot of people, or it sort of messes things up for a lot of people, or when somebody is just completely, I mean, just more than reasonably selfish, like the capitalistic big business people, or even just sort of the and I don't want to, so I shouldn't say it, but the bulldozing type of individuals. I don't know if that's necessarily extroverted thinking, but it's when short-sighted things are done sort of myopically and quick-handed, and the sort of full picture of what is being accomplished or done to the larger parameters or community, when that happens and I see that directly in the world, particularly with the economic problems that are presently going on in America, that stuff really brings out a righteous, and I say righteous because it just seems morally correct. I don't know where this feeling sort of comes from, but it brings out a very, very serious indignation out of me, and it's about the only time to where I really, really, really don't like someone or some group. It's very difficult, and that's one thing I should say too. Most of the time my emotions are directed towards me. They're not really directed at someone else, and a lot of times they're directed at ideas and things I think are stupid, like fallacies bother the hell out of me. I don't know why, but when those sorts of things, and I think it's because there's some sort of nexus point between it's just the TI-FE axes that when gross logical misrepresentations happen and then they affect a community, that just, whoa, that I don't, sorry, it's hard for me to talk about it. That really, 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 really bothers me, and it's just a very, very, very strong indignation. And Yeah, that's really the emotional space I live in. I kind of readily always experience anxiety. I am highly self-critical. I feel somewhat jovial in most instances and spaces and places because I'm fairly laid back and I'm calm, but on the inside, whoa, there's a lot of intensity. And just in the internal space, emotions, they just don't present themselves very usefully to me or in any manner I can understand them without any sort of external help. And that too can be something that's very hard for an INTP. My NF friends, they act like shrinks for me a lot of times because I don't know what the hell's going on. But and two, that it just seems to be that people and their actions really within a community really can bring out or elicit some sort of emotional response from me. And I would say finally, just what people actually do to me. Um, yeah, don't try to control me. That's about the only thing that can certainly make me emotionally expressive. I can be very pedantic and even carefree and just chilling and cool. But the minute I feel like I'm coerced or manipulated, you will not find a very, very nice or friendly me. And I would be as, sorry, I would be as venomously confrontational as I could possibly be as my rather usually benign self, but I don't like that. And so that's the emotional experiences of this INTP, and I don't know if that accurately captures just what emotions are for other INTPs, but because again, as I said before, just what somebody's emotional landscape is something fairly complex, and so many factors shape it, including trauma, and so it's really hard to actually get at what may be going on in the emotional space of another person. But nonetheless, upon request, this is what I can sort of lend to the community and my thoughts and my experience and the whole matter. So thank you, and hopefully this was insightful because this was just very anxiety laden for me. So thank you for watching.